when we start to dig into some of what the four Gospels tell us about John, what we really realise is that he has a message for our times, but what he was saying then is just as applicable to us now. In verse 3 of Luke chapter 3, we read that John went preaching that people should be baptised to show they had turned to God for the forgiveness of their sins. Baptism also served as a form of conversion for people. It was, if you like, a rite of passage. Jews would view anybody who wasn't a Jew as a Gentile, and therefore anybody who was a Gentile was considered unclean. And this role that they had of being a sort of light to the nations, of being a vineyard for the nations, much of that had got lost along the way. But if a Gentile wanted to become a Jew, wanted to become part of that sort of identity and be sort of change their nationality, they would go through something called baptism. There would be this coming down into the water of a river from one side, being baptised and coming out the other. There was a passing from the old to the new. And again, John is picking up this imagery that would be known to people at the time. There's very much this sense that baptism was something familiar to the people of the day, where they would pass from one side to the other. There was a sense of going in and dying to the old and being reborn to the new, of being immersed completely as a sign of being completely serious, but also completely cleaned and completely consumed. So John is adopting a familiar practice and reapplying it to his message. He's doing this before Jesus came and before the church had begun. So his baptism is a baptism about being cleansed from sin. And his message, as we will see, is about preparing the way, preparing for people to get right with God. And what he was looking for was for people who were genuinely hungry for the reality of the presence of God. So if John was looking for people who were genuinely hungry for the presence of God and genuinely wanted to get right with God and was asking them to do this as a sign of that taking God seriously, the church adopted baptism as one of its sacraments, and we don't tend to use that word very much when it comes to a lot of the sort of evangelical church. But sacrament is, if you like, something which is considered sacred and holy, and something which is a key part of the Christian rites of passage. And after Jesus' death, his resurrection, his ascension, and Pentecost comes and the Holy Spirit is poured out, the church has adopted this practice of baptism for some similar reasons to John. It's adopted them to show that there's been a conversion. There's an adoption to show that it's shown that we're serious about following God and taking God seriously. But it's got an added dimension because of the Holy Spirit and because of Jesus. Jesus himself, as we'll see as we journey on with John, was himself baptised, and he didn't need to be baptised to be cleansed from sin because he was without sin. However, he did it to show his surrender to God. And what we then see with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit is that baptism takes on this whole new meaning of what it means to nail our colours to the mast and to say, I'm serious about following God. I'm going to identify with Jesus in his death and his resurrection, and to show my conversion, my movement from the old to the new. I used to live that way, now I'm going to live this way. We see in Acts 19 that when Paul turns up at a church and they're baptising people with John's baptism for the forgiveness of sins, he introduces them to the Holy Spirit and the idea of being baptised in the Holy Spirit. That because of what Jesus has done, his victory on the cross over the powers of death and the powers of sin, and this powerful image of baptism of being completely immersed in order to identify with the death and resurrection of Jesus, makes it possible for us to now be baptised with the Holy Spirit. And my question to you today is, Have you been baptized in water? Have you identified with Jesus? Have you nailed your colours to the mast to say, I want to take God seriously, and God, I want you to take me seriously, so I'm going to be baptized as a symbol that I've left my old way of life behind, and I'm going to follow a new way of life with Jesus. And have you also experienced baptism in the Holy Spirit? That actually, because of Pentecost, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, the Father sent the Holy Spirit to be with us, to empower us to live this life for God. And baptism speaks so much more to us today than even it did to the people who were here in John. John is a forerunner. He's pointing people towards what Jesus is going to come and do. And when we look at baptism, he's pointing people towards a future identification with Jesus. Have you been baptized?